Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, and guests assembled here in Accra, it's an honor for me to join you in talking about the most important thing that we could possibly talk about on this continent, which is education. This is the 4th Africa Education Summit, and a very, very special thank you to our brother Hani Olawale of Global Skills Hub for driving the convening of these conferences. We hope and believe that it's the 4th of many hundreds to come into the future, even after we are gone. To come together and talk about education on this continent really means to come together and talk about both the past of Africa and the future of Africa. My message as one of the honorees today, one of the few people selected to receive awards today, is that when we look at Africa in the last 500 years, we are at an inflection point. We're at a point of a new beginning. We've spent 500 years both being victimized and thinking of ourselves as victims. We must now shift to thinking about the next 500 years in which we begin a completely new narrative. This is a narrative about how to build the Africa of our children and our children's children. And it cannot be built on the old narrative of being colonized, being enslaved, being victimized. It must be built on a narrative of agency in which our children, our grandchildren, and their children see themselves as agents and see themselves at parity with the rest of humanity. Africa is one of the 6 settled continents, and it's our responsibility to demand parity. And yes, as our brother Obama said repeatedly during his campaigns, yes, we can. We can be at parity with the rest of the continents, and we will be at parity with the rest of the continents. The formula is education. And therefore, it's really wonderful that we're gathered in Accra for the 4th Africa Education Summit. In 2022, thinking about education in perspective, as I was asked to speak, in 2022, the World Bank and UNESCO published a report of the title Learning Poverty, which most of you have seen or read. In this report, it was a reminder to us that as much as Africa is educating its people, that when you take a careful look at what is happening, 80% of our children are in school but not learning. In other words, it is true that African children are now in school, but 8 out of 10 are not learning. And this is confirmed by many reports, including that one that's highly respected, that the World Bank and UNESCO published in 2022. But this should not be seen as a negative. This should be seen as a reminder that we've done step 1 very well, which is to get children into schools and institutions of learning. Now, step 2 must be for all of us to imagine ways of getting everybody to contribute to making sure that these children are not just in school, but they are learning. Okay, this is very, very important. We have to struggle to do this, and it will take time. But while we are ensuring that all children are in school, which is part of really the requirement of the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, that we must at the same time, in parallel, move to a second idea. In my opinion, there are really 2 major ideas in education, the way I see it. Idea number 1 is universal education for everybody. And to get our universal education right will take a lot of time because of limited resources. Idea number 2 is where our most talented, most ambitious, most motivated students are given a special education and brought to special institutions and to special programs that will enable them to become the leaders that will industrialize Africa. To achieve the African Union's Agenda 2063, in which the African Union talks of a shift from poverty to economic prosperity will require ensuring that Africa's most talented, most gifted, most motivated, and most determined children are educated. So it is our responsibility to identify these children, and many of them who cannot afford for education, we have to provide them access. Those who can afford to pay, they pay. Those who cannot afford to pay, we pay for them. We have to find ways to do this. And the good news is that we are sitting here in Ghana, where there's already a powerful model that more than 20 years ago, Ashesi University was built in Ghana, and it's an excellent model of an institution that provides highly motivated students with an excellent world-class education. At Ashesi, which I see as a model, 25% of students are highly gifted but cannot afford to pay for their education, and so they go to school on scholarships. So one of the things that we need across Africa is institutions of the quality of Ashesi, and the private sector should really take a lead in building these institutions, even as we struggle with getting the public sector, getting our governments to redesign their policies. When it comes to the public sector, as we all know, until the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s and early 90s, almost every African country had an excellent university. Kenya had the University of Nairobi. I'm from Kenya myself, even though I'm the chairman of the University Council at Cavendish University in Uganda. I'm from Kenya, where University of Nairobi was a world-class institution. Makerere in Kampala was world-class. Ibadan in Nigeria was world-class. The University of Ghana was world-class. But all these, our public universities, as most of you are aware, have declined because there were changes in funding and changes in education policy driven by the structural adjustment, or SAP, of the 1980s and early 1990s. So when it comes to thinking about our public institutions, both primary schools, secondary schools, and universities, we know that there is work to do, and this is really to get back to influencing our governments and to pressuring our governments democratically to go back to a model in which idea number 2 is espoused and supported even among public institutions. We do not want a situation where if you have 74 universities, as the case is in Kenya, for instance, or if you have over 200 universities, as the case is in Nigeria, in which all your 200 universities or all your 70 plus universities are identical. Nobody does this. All the successful countries in the world have a hierarchy of institutions, because not every human being has the same level of ambition or has the same level of giftedness or the same level of determination. The most determined, the most gifted citizens should be educated in the correct ecosystems. So this is really the secret to Africa's industrialization, that we must have institutions that are based on what I call idea number 2, which is the idea that the most gifted, most talented, most motivated are given special support to attend well-designed educational institutions that sit in ecosystems of excellence. It's a mistake to imagine that you can have excellence in the midst of mediocrity. Okay, if you have students going to a university where they're in a special program and they're well funded, but all their friends and all their neighbors within the university are actually living under mediocre conditions and being educated under mediocre conditions, as is the case in what are called centers of excellence within African public universities, this will not work well, because excellence functions based in ecosystems of excellence. And that's why you have innovation hubs worldwide that work very well. When you look at, say, India, you have the innovation hub in Bangalore that's world class, which is centered around the Indian Institute of Science. When you look at the most famous one in the world, which is the innovation hubs around Stanford University and UC Berkeley, they're world class and they're actually the leading innovation hubs. China's built its own multiple innovation hubs. all the most rapidly developing countries like South Korea, like Taiwan, like Israel, all of them have innovation hubs that are centered around excellent universities. This is what we have to do if Africa is to actually achieve what the AU calls Agenda 2063, where by 2063 Africa should have shifted from poverty to economic prosperity. The formula to getting there, in my opinion, is idea number 2, where we all, beginning in our villages and in our neighborhoods in the cities, pay attention to children that seem to be unusually motivated, seem to be unusually gifted, seem to be unusually determined, the outliers. It's these outliers that we must nurture, that we must assist, that we must bring into the right institutions, we must mentor them, because they will be the agents of Africa's industrialization. And Africa has actually, in many, many ways, ended up being responsible for the human future. Because if you look at the current demographic reports, all the other 5 continents have either slowed down in terms of population growth, or in some cases come very close to 0 population growth. But Africa's population is still growing very rapidly. So this means, as a lot of studies have shown, that within 10 years, 10 to 20 years, more than 30% of the global workforce will be out of Africa. And by 2063, the majority of youth entering the global workforce will actually be out of Africa. So it's really important to make sure that the African demographic bulge, in which we have more and more youth, in which Africa continues to happily reproduce as other continents either slow down or stop, becomes a blessing. If we do not fix our education policies, the rapid population rise in Africa will become a nightmare, in which we shall be unable to sleep in our homes because there will be many young, strong youth outside our gates with empty stomachs. It is very important to make sure that we use education as the primary tool for actually shifting Africa's demographic advantage into becoming a genuine advantage both for Africa and for the rest of the world. For the rest of the world, because as populations elsewhere move towards 0 growth, the rest of the world will look to Africa as a source of skilled labor, as a source of human labor. Even though there is dramatic progress in artificial intelligence, and the arrival of artificial general intelligence is in the horizon, and some even say we've already really arrived at this singularity, there will still be a need for human labor. You will still need bright people, energetic people to work alongside artificial intelligence systems and to monitor the artificial intelligence systems and to collaborate with these AI systems. And within 50 or so years, the majority of these talented, energetic people will be coming out of Africa. And therefore, the education of African youth and the redirection of African education policies is not only the business of African countries, it's in many ways the business of all of humanity. And yet we have to worry about the other reality about humanity, is that humanity tends to think in tribal terms, for lack of a better words. So we shouldn't assume that non-Africans will have their primary focus in solving African problems. We hope and pray that they will continue to be our good partners. We want them to be our good partners, but the primary responsibility for industrializing Africa, for eliminating poverty in Africa, for moving Africans to economic parity with the rest of the world remains African. This is really what we must worry about. In this 4th Africa Education Summit, my main message to all of us and to the rest of Africa is that the best way to ensure that Africa begins its journey in a strong way towards industrialization, and industrialization is of course the primary means of moving towards economic prosperity, as the rest of the world has done, is to actually not invent the wheel, not reinvent the wheel, but simply look at what other countries have done other countries that were just as poor as African countries 60 years ago. You can look at India, you can look at South Korea, you can look at Taiwan, you can look at Vietnam, and you'll see that mostly what countries like India have done is to continue struggling with educating the whole population, yes, but in parallel making sure that their most gifted and most motivated students and children are placed in ecosystems that develop talent to the highest possible level that human ability allows to happen. That's why, let's say, if you look at India, you have the Indian Institute of Science, you have the IITs that we all know about. When you look at the United States, you have the Ivy League, which remains a global model. When you look at the UK, you have the Russell 24, with Cambridge and Oxford at the top. This remains an open secret that I've talked about elsewhere. And I find it worth repeating at this wonderful 4th Africa Education Summit, in which I'm honored to be one of the recipients of the award for Impact on Africa. And I'm particularly happy about this award because the recognition of my work in helping to build libraries in many African countries. Beginning the early 2000s, I set up very many libraries in Gauteng province in South Africa. I helped ship out of America over 2 million books for setting libraries in many, many African countries, including Nigeria, Swaziland, Ghana, etc. And right now I'm focused on actually building a model of a village learning center that supports many, many schools. And this is through an organization that I co-founded with my friends. The name of the organization is Kiwimbi. And Kiwimbi means a ripple, small ripple that will grow into a big wave. And the idea of Kiwimbi is actually based on the work of our late brother Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who most of you have read and admire. Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his book Homecoming, talked about the need for centers of learning in our villages. In other words, Ngugi was talking about a need for a library in every village, a library in every village. And that's really the second idea that supports what I call idea number 2, the need for ensuring that access to learning and access to volunteer mentoring and tutoring is available to all our African children in villages and in urban neighborhoods. Ngugi made a call for a library in every village. I read Ngugi's book Homecoming when I was in secondary school, and the idea stayed in my mind until I was able to effect it when I was a professor at Rutgers University in the United States. I returned to Kenya in 2011, and I currently work with Africa Education Holdings, which is also referred to Cavendish Africa. And this is a company that is focused on making sure that more and more Africans have access to high quality education. So in other words, what I'm really saying is that for all of us who are listening to this conversation today at the 4th Africa Education Summit, that we should think in terms of how we can set up small micro libraries in our villages or in our urban neighborhoods, so that children have access to places where they can read, places where they can access computers and access the internet and access tutors and access role models. I have set up one such entity in my own village where I was born and raised in Western Kenya at Amagoro. I've also helped to set up very many of these or similar libraries across Africa. And therefore I receive this honor today really with humility, because this is important work that I value quite greatly, and it is the work through which we can make impact. So my appeal to everybody is that in whatever small way you can, let us stimulate more learning, let us galvanize learning, let us contribute to having small libraries and big libraries in our villages and in our urban neighborhoods. Africa is urbanizing rapidly. Let us get more and more people to commit to helping children. One area in which Africa remains dramatically weak is STEM. As we talk about industrialization, African education must pay attention to the question of STEM. Those of us that are linked to universities must begin to actually make sure that all our universities have volunteer programs where university students volunteer to tutor secondary school students and primary school students in mathematics. Mathematics is the foundation of STEM, and STEM education is the foundation of industrialization. This is what we see when we look at what has happened in the rest of the world. So it's dramatically important for us to make sure that African children get a strong foundation in mathematics, which then makes it more likely for them to succeed in the STEM subjects, in the sciences and in the mathematical subjects that like finance and accounting, in medicine, in engineering, in computer science and artificial intelligence. The STEM foundation is critical. Again, I'll go back to the report of 2022 by the World Bank and UNESCO. Our children are in school, but they're not learning. We can do something about that. All our universities should play a role in making sure that the millions of African students who are at university are committed to volunteering to tutor the children in secondary and primary schools. That is one of the messages I would like to share with all of you to take home. Very, very important. Because these are things we can do. And some of them actually do not require money. They simply require vision and a commitment to having each one teach one, the way African Americans said during their civil rights struggle. Each one teach one. So this is very, very important that we make sure that STEM education is a focus. And in thinking about STEM education, we need also global metrics. The OECD, the 38 countries of the OECD have an assessment called PISA, P-I-S-A, the Program for International Student Assessment. And there's also another global assessment called TIMSS, the Trends in International Math and Science. These global metrics, African countries should participate in them. The most recent OECD PISA had no African country participation. And in the past, when African countries have participated, like many years ago, Zambia participated and its performance in mathematics was demonstrated a need for us to actually participate more in PISA so that you have an external measure. When Zambia participated, only 2% of Zambian 15-year-olds were proficient in mathematics using a global metric. This we can change by strengthening the foundation in mathematics. So one of my other messages in thinking about Africa, education and perspective, is that we should actually encourage more and more African countries, and we can even have private efforts to make this happen, participate in PISA, which is an OECD global metric. And while doing that, we should in parallel be trying to set up our own global equivalent of PISA. Just the way Ashesi University has set up the Education Collaborative, which started in Ghana, but now spreading across Africa to get more and more African educators and African universities to share ideas, to collaborate, to visit each other, and to learn from each other. So besides doing this, we shall need an Africa-wide assessment, and we shall at the same time need, in parallel, to participate in global assessments that have been set up elsewhere, such as PISA of the OECD and TIMSS. This way, we can have confidence that we are actually educating our children. And again, we shall have to rely on actual numbers, we shall have to rely on measurements. The current measurements don't look good. As I mentioned, the UNESCO 2022 report says, yes, our children are in school, but 80% of them are not learning. And this is opposite. In the OECD, the numbers are actually reverse. Only 10% of the children are not learning. For us, it's 80%. So we have many, many problems, but we have a choice. We can either look at these problems as a reason to become depressed and give up, or we can look at problems as an opportunity. My message to all of you is we must look at these problems as an opportunity. We should use all our creativity to solve our problems in parallel. Provide education for everybody, that's idea number one, and at the same time provide well-organized education for the most gifted, most talented, most determined, most motivated African children in either special schools or special universities or in special honors programs, both at the high school level and at the university level. And all our universities should actually be encouraged to have honors programs, as is the case in most North American universities. And all of them should be encouraged to have scholarship programs for highly talented students. And every one of our 54 African countries, every one of them should have at least one university that can be looked at as the Ivy League of that country, or the IISC if you use the Indian model of that country. There should be one university in every country that's highly protected, even as we struggle to improve all of the rest of the universities. There has to be a hierarchy of universities. And this is not anti-democratic. It's simply accepting what has happened in the rest of the world. If you look at China, you have the C9 with Tsinghua and the University of Peking at the very top. If you look at the UK, you have Cambridge and Oxford at the top. If you look at the US, you have the top 30 with the Ivy League and the rest of the Ivy League like institutions like Stanford at the top. So the idea that and I'm being repetitive here, the idea that our institutions should all be identical is a huge mistake in African education. So in summary, I will say that for us to prepare Africa for what the African Union calls Agenda 2063, that our education systems should run in parallel. Education for everybody, which is idea number one, and we have to struggle to find ways to keep improving that. And then education for our most gifted, most determined, most motivated, most talented in special schools and in special universities, at least one such university per country. Ladies and gentlemen, that is my appeal to Africa. May God bless you.